Alrighty, we are going live. Hello everyone. Welcome to a conversation with ui.dev's Tyler McGinnis and Codesmith CEO Will Sentance. I'm Ashley, I'm the Event and Content Senior Coordinator at Codesmith, and we're so excited to be hosting this YouTube live event for y'all. We encourage everyone who's tuning in to say hi in the chat, introduce yourself, and let us know where you're tuning in from. If you have any questions for Will and Tyler throughout the evening, let us know in the chat. This is meant to be an interactive session, and we want you to be a part of driving tonight's discussion. So with that, I'm excited to welcome Tyler and Will.
Hello, delighted to be here.
Same. Let's do this. It's been a minute. We've been planning this for a while, so good to finally do it.
Exactly.
In to say hi in the
and I'm looking forward to seeing all the questions. I just went to the chat, and that's amazing. So I think we're going to kind of kick off right with maybe, I guess, a kind of few words about what inspired our different paths. Maybe a few words, Tyler. I'm sure you're more adept at this than I am, about what kind of inspired you to follow this path, and I'll have to do the same. And then we've got some maybe topics to touch on. And then really we are deferring to our lovely audience to throw us actual material to talk about. So do you want to kick it off, man?
Yeah. So I'm Tyler, founder of ui.dev, where basically it is our job to help JavaScript developers stay relevant with the ever moving and ever changing and ever opinionated JavaScript ecosystem. So that's pretty much what I do full time, is create courses, content. We have a community, pretty much like all day, every day. I'm kind of like thinking of ways to teach JavaScript better, which is fun to be talking to you because you also pretty much have that same mindset, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've referenced Tyler many times because although I kind of have a strict thing of never watching anyone else's talks because I don't want to, maybe it's a silly idea, but I don't want to I want to do it my way. And I also don't want to end up, implicitly drawing. For me, part of the process of producing content is the wrestling with understanding it myself, which usually is about going through the building or the docs or whatever. If there's one person I've actually watched videos from, really the only person ever, is you, actually. You. And besides, I think I once watched a video by Brian Holt, a long time ago.
He's great. He's great too. So he's good too.
Let's give Brian credit, but no one else. I literally have never. And your React videos are obviously world class, and so there's a like-mindedness, I think, also in terms, and we'll talk about many of these different things, I think, but in terms of what really is, and I got a chance to see ui.dev's site evolution recently, and that centering on community, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but community is being, I was actually just doing some interviews with some team candidates and talking about aspiration. What is aspiration? To me, aspiration is saying up here is worth my time, going for something hard is worth my time, but equal to that is the community of people around me saying, you deserve to be up here, and we are going to help you practically get there. And so, yeah, I saw ui.dev is kind of centering more and more on that community piece, but doing it the right way. And so, yeah, that's amazing. But yeah, a few words on me. Started Codesmith, I guess, 6 years ago now, with that same goal: go deeper in one's understanding and set oneself a kind of higher bar, not shortcuts, not. It's funny, boot camps are considered kind of shortcuts, and I hope that Codesmith's the opposite to that, doing it the hard way, doing it the real way, but equal to that, the support to make that possible. I think that's kind of the same model that we both take.
Yeah, I think we both have the same ethos when it comes to, ironically, business as well as education, which is it's easy to, for example, have a course about React that just npm installs a bunch of stuff. You glue it all together, and then you have this app, right? But there's not much fundamental or first principles foundation there, right? And that's what we try to get away from, and that's what I love about Codesmith too, and why I've always recommended it, is because it's that same approach too, where it's like, this should be hard, like by definition. And there's ways that we can make like the path easier for you, but it isn't necessarily through like making the material easier, right? Because by definition, the material is hard, right? It's about the community, it's about the support, it's about the way we structure curriculum, and that just comes with iteration, testing, like basically just like putting in the hours, right, to get to produce the thing. So,
the original kind of co-founder of Codesmith, Alex, he's been using the phrase like, this is very okay. So we've got to also criticize each other. Otherwise, at this point, this has become
the problem is like, I think the statement of like, you're my favorite JavaScript teacher and I'm your favorite JavaScript teacher is true, which is unfortunate for anybody watching because it just looks like a weird like love fest. But like when we talk naturally, not recorded, it is also kind of like this as well.
Yeah, which is why we had to keep our conversation short, because it's
yes.
It escalates. But Alex was like, and I think this sounds incredibly over the top, but this isn't my view, and it isn't my saying it of anything I've done or even about. But Alex was like, look, putting together a program or anything where you're trying to give someone a conceptual mental model of something, including their own kind of confidence around it or self-belief, is, he said, a work of is a piece of art. Okay, this is ridiculous, but I do deeply respect that I was looking at some slides from the hiring program, and it's like, oh my god, they were a mess at the beginning. Like, they had an essential thing that worked, but it's a funny ambivalence that I feel, or a kind of, you have to hold two things in your head at the same time. On the one hand, you have to truly believe in what you're saying, because your conviction is partly what inspires others to believe in themselves. But you also got to, at a deeper level, they use the phrase growth mindset, and that's the thing. I'm like, I don't think I'm very good at that, but I will not rest until every last edge case has been preempted in the content. Every last piece has been like set up. And so you talk about iteration. Like, I'm sure your stuff started out messy, and my god, I taught the closure hard parts probably 20 times before I began to understand closure. And back in those days, I mean, something I think is something I'm wrestling with, and I don't know how you think about this. And some people do it by just owning, like, I'm going to learn in public. And I think that's badass. It's probably not my style, but if anyone watched early versions of any of the hard parts, oh my God, they saw it was a mess. Now, as you become, more established, it becomes harder to do that. Like, I've got a UI development hard parts thing I want to, practice and go for. I meant to be doing it on Friday evening. I said maximum 20 people. And honestly, I think those people are going to have to sign, not literally, but it will be, I'm not even sure I can, do it, but that means you constantly defer, because messiness becomes harder and harder to maintain. I don't know how you think about that, but like you set a very, very high bar. How do you, I'm just, it's interesting to think about it. I don't have an answer to this. How does one create that same incremental improvement, which I'm sure you went through, but when people do have a high expectation, and quite right too. I don't know how you think about that. I haven't really resolved it, besides pretending to do talks and then rescheduling them when last minute. Just one thing. I wanted a run that was so bad that I pretended the internet cut out. If anyone was ever on that talk, by the way.
Amazing.
I just thought, just in case they could tell, I pulled the Ethernet cable out of the wall. And I shouldn't say that, that's actually, but anyway. So how do you deal with that?
I think I don't know if there's like a good answer, because part of that's like part of the journey, right? Is especially as you're like teaching new things, is naturally the thing's going to suck more early on than it does later. And so I think it's just being comfortable with that evolution, and being comfortable with the fact that like maybe your best work is behind you. And like, as humans, we don't like to admit that. And I don't think it is for either of us. But if it is, like, that's okay, because we still have good work ahead of us, right? At least that's how I think of it. So for example, it's funny because both of us are kind of known for our like execution context lessons, right? Like closures and all of those things. Like literally when I did our course on that, I built like essentially like a JavaScript interpreter that like goes and steps through everything with like scopes and closures. And as I was building that, I was like, I don't know if I'm ever going to like get better than this, because I don't really know like if the opportunity will come up to do this thing again in this way, right? And I'll read some of my stuff from like 2018 that I haven't looked at in a few years. I'm like, wow, this is like pretty good. And even if I tried to write it today, I don't know if I'd be able to write as well as I did back then. I don't know why. But I think that's fine. Like, I think it's never bothered me, because like I think it's in like the doing of the thing that's more important rather than the result, right? That's what I try to focus on. Like the result can be a thing, and that's fine. Hopefully it's a good thing. But to me, it's always like the process and like sitting down, doing the thing. Like that's the beautiful part. And that's like the hard part, right? Like that's the struggle, and like the success and the joy and all of that should be in the struggle, not necessarily like the outcome of that.
Yeah. The pleasure is the doing of it. And you know, you and I both know that I think we both take pride in building entities, organizations. Like my love is first, honestly, at this point, building the team. Like that's my favorite thing. Mm-hmm. But then alongside that, I love like, yeah, the craft of putting together the talks. It's brutal at times and incredibly frustrating. And I moan about it. Oh, I still right now I'm working on a UI hard parts, but it's incredibly hard also because of what we don't acknowledge. At least maybe I think you actually are a talented engineer, whereas I think it's not my day as much, let's say.
Sure. Yeah.
And so it is incredibly challenging, but the pleasure of learning something is why I used to say, actually, the person who gets the most out of hard parts is me, because mm-hmm. I'm the one who gets to build it. And it's by mm-hmm. the building of it that the real kind of, and I think that links to the model of Codesmith. And I think to the model of ui.dev, it's like, it's not the watching the course. It's not the whole premise of Codesmith is hard part shows you that you can build a complete conceptual model of something, but you're not going to have a complete conceptual model of the code base that you join on. Like mm-hmm. This is kind of like an exemplar after, by the way, hundreds and hundreds of runs. Like that's why mm-hmm. it's an exemplar, not because of some like magic insight, just like a lot of runs. But you're going to build your own as a resident in Codesmith or as an engineer on the job. You're going to build your own, and your goal should be to, I guess, to some extent, build your own kind of hard parts mental model of the given code base, which means patient stepping through each piece. It means going one layer deeper as to the why on each thing. And to me, that's why I think I get the most out of hard parts, because it's really about the pleasure, or not the pleasure, the intellectual pursuit of the figuring the thing out. And what really, I think, you said how we can't, and it's something I want to actually get your thoughts on as well, about like, how do you do it online? Because online is a place of distractions and, all these sort of things. Like, it's not about making learning hard for the sake of it. It's that the kind of going one level deeper that gives you the conceptual model from which you can have real insights is just essentially a hard thing, like at its very core. And so when, in a weird way, I think hard parts is sometimes a little bit of a trick, because it makes it appear like it's there. And actually, really, it's like we all have to go and do those ourselves for any given concept. And when we have that, then we're, intellectually liberated, so to speak. But our job is to create the example, and then the framework in which people can go and develop those mental models in a given code base, which is going to be completely unique, probably a unique thing to them because they're working on a particular piece of it from a particular lens and with a particular background. Mm-hmm. They've got to go and develop that themselves. And Codesmith gives you the foundations for that, hopefully to go on and do so. My sense is ui.dev gives people the ongoing, recurrent support to do that for the years and years ahead, which we don't really, we sort of say, hey, you're there. Now you've got the mental models to go and develop your own new mental models. ui.dev said, well, actually, hey, knock, knock, you may need ongoing support and encouragement in going deeper and the right way. I don't know. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the big reasons for the emphasis recently on like community, because like with a problem you don't have is like completion rates, right? Like if people sign up, there's a good chance if you sign up day one, like you're going to finish the thing. Cause like it's such a commitment, whether people are moving to LA or like whatever it is, right? Like it's a huge barrier. So if they get there, go through the prerequisites, like they're in, right? Where with us, it's easy to like almost have like a feel good moment when you give us money, right? Because it's like, oh, I feel like I did something. When in reality, you really haven't done anything, right? So yeah, you just get this like dopamine hit of like, oh, I gave them money and like I'm going to learn this thing, and then you check out, right? So I think with us, what we're trying to do, and like the way we structure courses isn't like I mentioned earlier, like it's not, we don't necessarily try to make them easy, right? We try to make them as simple as possible to go through, but that's very different than, again, just like npm installing a bunch of stuff, like gluing them together, then you have the project, right? Like we really try to approach it from like first principles. And so by like definition, almost it's harder to get through like a course from us, just because we do take that very slow, very linear approach. And so I think community is really our hope of like optimizing for success of students over the long run as much as we can, because in it, you naturally comes all the benefits of community, right? Where you can, for example, when someone signs up nowadays, we do like individual onboarding with everybody who signs up if they want it. So it has like a calendar they can go and they can like, we get to know them, get to know their goals, recommend courses. And then ideally we see you in the community. We have this concept called like journeys, which is basically like, if you just graduated the boot camp and you're like on like interview prep, then like essentially your journey is like interview prep, and like you list out the steps you're going to take. And that way other community members and, us, part of the ui.dev, can like see your progress and like help you do that, right? So it's essentially like our approach to almost make it more like a traditional boot camp where you have that support system, just like async, doing it like online the way we can do best. So,
and I think that speaks to something that, I mean, we have some topics here, don't we? But like somewhere, oh yeah. We put some notes together, didn't we? Modes of education and what is the future of education, and like how does one think about, if someone were to ask me what's the goal of education, I mean it's way too broad a thing. There are different positions, different stages to take, and different roles to play, and that's I think why you and our spaces are so complementary of each other, because there are just different pieces of the puzzle. But one thing I do sometimes wonder at is, we both focus on, for want of a better way of thinking about it, I don't want to say hard learning, that's just, it's kind of cliche, but also I'm not really sure what it means. But like, yeah, going deeper, doing the mental, having the mental agility to push, that moment when you're trying to figure something out, and it's when you most want to go and like, switch to a YouTube, you go and do something else, and yet if you stick in that next 3 minutes, that's when the breakthrough happens. Like that accumulating those is like, that's the most productive learning. And yet, honestly, a lot of great platforms that I really admire, Udemy, Udacity, all these sort of things, and honestly, probably a lot of people watching some of our videos at times, they don't go and do the like push, and yet there's still value to it. And like, I think. And so how does one think about the role we play in, because I admire programs that there's a lot of different paths to getting to, I guess, software engineer. And how does our approach, is it superior to somebody, doing a kind of taster type thing? Is it like, I don't know, I don't think either think it is superior, but like, how does it fit into that other stuff? Like, there's a lot of places where completion rate is like, let's just make it as much copy and paste as possible so that you keep going. Like, are there places for that? Are there roles for that? Like, I do admire Code Academy for getting a lot of people to get started. So I'm kind of curious, should there be a world where there are 50,000 people a year doing Codesmith and, 5 million people a year subscribing to ui.dev? Or are we, do you see what I mean? Like, I think we just have to kind of just think, what's our role within the impact of wanting people to be able to grow look like? Is it, do you know where I'm going?
Yeah. I think it's like an interesting, and this again ties back to like the philosophies of like business too, right? Where neither of us, I know you raised like a little bit of money, which is almost like nothing, if at all. Yeah, exactly.
That was paid back within 8 months.
Yes, and we're completely bootstrapped. So it's like, in order to, and I feel like both of us feel this way, right? In order to do the approach we're taking, we need as much, not necessarily time, but time a little bit. It's essentially like time, freedom, and like creativity to like experiment with like the medium, right? And I think ironically, both of us didn't raise money because of the fear of then having to push certain metrics that don't necessarily mean much to us. And so it's almost like our educational philosophy has influenced the business philosophy, right? Because like, I don't want to have to be pushing like MRR, ARR, like any of those things. I would rather be pushing like, the best product that we can make. And then eventually, like, if we ever get there, who knows if that's true, then we can start worrying about like hardcore, month over month growth. But until then, like, we're just going to kind of put our heads down and make the best like material we can, and hopefully have the best student outcomes we can. And then theoretically, the rest should hopefully start taking care of itself, right? And I think we both have obviously had success, but that's the way I look at it. Is like the education philosophy influences the business philosophy, which is fine because that's kind of the way I want it. So to answer your question, like, I think there's room, and there should be room for like everybody. Like, obviously, some people I'm sure hate our courses, and some people like wouldn't jive at Codesmith. The reviews disagree with that, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there, right? And just because it is a different, like some people may just like to go and like be gluing things together and like jumping into the docs and like, have it be a little bit more like less linear. But I like where we fit in. It's been very like strategic, but yeah, I'm sure it's good that other things exist, because like, I think there's kind of, everyone has different approaches. So
yeah, absolutely. And to me, in the end, that patient and steady approach to me is everything. And in the end, like, I still remember, it was frustrating. Like, we would get these results, these outcomes, and people just didn't seem to, care. But it takes time. But in the end, if you do just focus on that core, then it does pay off. Like, it does in the end. Like, people start to notice, and that's good. Okay, should we just look at our questions?
Let's do it. Yep.
Yeah. So we've got we've got Ali in Indonesia. We've got Jeff in Burbank. We've got a person here called Excellently Knowledgeable, who I think I've seen comments on other YouTube videos with the question, why is recursion that difficult? That is a really good question. I was just trying to rebuild React as part of my ui.dev thing, UI hard parts thing, and yeah, recursion. Anyway, I definitely figuring it out. Orlando from Florida, that's lovely. Who else? Got Jay from California, Kurt from Arizona, that's lovely. Anyway, lovely to have all of you here, but I'm seeing no questions. We came very unprepared, people. We've got a list
Let's dive into the recursion one. That's kind of a question. Was that a serious question or like a joke question?
I think it's a real question. I think it's actually
okay. Let's dive into it.
Okay.
I have a theory about recursion. I don't hear people talk about often. What I like, Tanner, actually, I had this talk with Tanner. Tanner was a really good friend of mine, went through Codesmith, really successful. He hit the recursion part of Codesmith. He reached out to me. like, hey, what's going on? Here's my theory about recursion. So what's nice about recursion is it feels like it can be like brute forced, because with programming in general, a lot of it is like getting your brain to the point where you can think about the thing like rationally, right? And that's just hard because you can't, yeah, you can't brute force that. It just takes time. Recursion, on the other hand, you can start pattern matching when recursion is necessary. And because of that, you can kind of brute force your way to get to the point where you can start pattern matching, right? Like once you see 100 recursion problems and you solve them all, the 101st really isn't that different than the other 100, right? Where with programming in general, that's not always true because there's always like different weird mental models you have to solve. With recursion though, like for me, it was just like, okay, I'm going to spend 72 hours looking at every recursion thing, reading every recursion thing, solving every recursion problem. And then it's like, oh yeah, like I get it because it's a pattern.
It's so
yeah,
funny,
exactly.
It's so funny to quote Alex again. He said, look, and Alex is one of those, I mean, I'll be honest, he is very, very like, I don't believe too much in kind of underlying ability, because in the end, in my very, very core, I believe hard work is the way in which things are accomplished. But there may be some people whose minds are like, linked up to perhaps pick up on technical things very quickly. Never me. He is that. And even he said of recursion, you know what? It is a pattern recognition. You've just got to become very, very, and I think that's partly because you can take an iterative approach, so to speak, to regular code execution. It's this, then this, then this, then this, then this, and really map the full thing out. Whereas with recursion, I mean, definitionally, that's not what you're doing. Like it is a different way of thinking. Here are these two states of being, and you are in one or other, and you better, accept that they are going to, from that is going to derive a pattern of behavior. And you can't join the dots between those two states, those two situations, and this outcome pattern of behavior. Those are not totally disconnectable, but they are, the mind struggles to make the link between the overall fractal, so to speak, and the rule of the individual node of a fractal. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. Let's see if we've got any questions here. Windu, hello in LA. Ashraf says very kindly, oh, that's lovely, but taking both of our courses, that's wonderful. Yeah, excellently knowledgeable. It was hopefully a real answer. It is a really, really conceptually challenging thing, but if I were to take away a strategy from it, from both Alex and Tyler, it's like, unfortunately, it's a real pattern recognition, brute force it a bit type thing. Oh, here we go. So I am Fot. The best thing about any live chat is doing usernames. Any thought on ideas for developer tools? I want to build some great tools for community, but I couldn't find an idea. Okay, I think that's phenomenal. It's something obviously that we do a lot at Codesmith, is building these developer tools. Ty, you want to take a?
Yeah, you probably have more of an answer for this one, just because you're always like, you have students who are needing projects. My perspective on it is like, dive into particular like libraries, and I think it'll become clear which ones could have like dev tools around them, right? Because there's like, when you say dev tools, it's so broad that you could be like, Vercel, and because they're essentially one big dev tool, right? Or you could be like React queries dev tools that they use to like see how queries happen, right? And so what I think basically for me, it's always whenever it comes to like idea generation, you just have to get in the weeds and just be in there and play around and like get in the dirt and see what's going on. And then when that happens, that's when ideas, it's the same thing for businesses too, right? Like if you're just sitting back trying to think of a business idea, probably not going to happen. But if you're super deep in the weeds of a super niche like area, there's a billion ideas you could come up with. And so that would be my recommendation, is just like, I don't have any, but I'm not in the weeds of like certain libraries or like all of those things, right? So I don't know.
Completely agree. What I'd add is just that I am Fotex, Photo X. I don't know. What I would add is just that I don't know your stage, but hi Shane, lovely to see you. I don't know your stage, but I think there's a really great moment as an engineer when you are adept enough to be able to actually solve some of those problems by building tools, especially with others, but you're still not willing to accept a kind of rubbish developer experience. There comes a point, I still remember when I did this IceCom thing, which did at a certain, anyway, project. And we gave a talk on it at Pivotal Labs, I think. And I still remember in the audience, as we said, and in 3 lines of code, you can get WebRTC working in your Angular app. And you saw the people that go, oh, 4 lines of code? I'm not saying they, actually want it to be complicated, but one becomes quite resilient, perhaps, to marginally bad developer user experiences. And so what I would say, the only thing I'd add is set yourself like, hey, it may seem complicated. Well, that might be something to solve. You may think that's because of you being, well, not quick enough at understanding something or quick enough at picking something up. Prepare to be surprised. The very greatest developers out there are struggling with that thing too. And if they're not, most of us are. And so look at what you're finding a pain in the ass or even just confusing, and know that that is not necessarily a failing on you, maybe a failing or maybe an opportunity to build something that makes that experience more pleasant. Either visualizes something or streamlines something or automates something or allows you to focus on the thing that really matters at the expense of the distractions in setting something up. Does that's the only thing I'd add to it.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, should we talk a little bit? We'll come back to some great questions coming here on from Ashraf and Windu. I think I know Windu. Lovely to hear from Windu. But let's just see if there's any other questions on our kind of list of topics that we talked about here. We've got what's our professional purpose? That's, I think we've sort of been talking to. I like this. What really makes a great software engineer, and how can we as educators, for want of a better word, cultivate those factors, and how can learners best develop those factors? We sort of touched on this as like what we're trying to solve for with our respective talks and platforms or whatever, but maybe more broadly, what are the perhaps underestimated things that make a great software engineer that we've seen in practice actually give somebody an edge, but maybe are under prioritized? I have thoughts on this, but maybe Tyler, you want to kind of kick off?
Yeah, I think it depends on what phase they're in, right? Like, I hate when someone's doing like job search and then this question gets brought up and people are like, oh, soft skills are underrated. It's like, yes, they are underrated, but like soft skills aren't going to be what gets you like your first developer job, right? So it really depends on like, that's the context of the answer you have to answer, or like the question you have to answer it in. And so with that said, I think if you already have a job and you're already like technical, then it's all soft skills, communication, being able to write well, right? To like show that you can communicate well and think like, in a like rational fashion, empathy, like all of those things. When it comes to like getting your first job, you obviously have way more experience there than I do. And so I'll defer to you on that. But I think there is, if you already have a job and you're already like fairly technical, because like you have to assume if you're working at a job as a developer, like you're fairly smart, you're fairly dedicated, like all those things kind of come with the job to get you there. And then really what separates you at that point is like everything else, right? In my opinion. So
yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is I kind of want to make a pitch. This is a fairly kind of I haven't thought this out too many times, but I want to kind of make a pitch that when we talk a lot about technical communication at Codesmith, ranges from the ability to talk through your code line by line specifically, all the way through to, I don't know, someone asks you what's your experience with Node, and you give an analysis of the trade-offs of using Node to solve a given problem, the 3 benefits and 1 maybe downside. But what that starts to sort of suggest to me is like, and I don't want to lose the meaning of the word technical communication, but that I don't even know what, God, I don't know too much about Pinker, but maybe this is the concept, or Chomsky, one of these, linguists, right? I don't know quite what conceptual ideas in one's head are without the language to be able to form them and force structure on them. And so I don't want to lose the meaning of the word technical communication, meaning just any conceptualizing that you can communicate to somebody else. But if you really have an internal mental model of some concept, and you are, kind of, if you really have it, then you have the ability to verbally structure it for someone else to have kind of knowledge access to as well.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not able to, then it's probably the case that you haven't actually, got that full mental model with all the kind of pieces, the dots joined up. So to me, it's like, and this isn't saying it's soft skills, although I think people do kind of capture this somewhat in soft skills. But to me, the thing that's underestimated by a long way is technical communication, especially if you're meant it to mean the ability to construct a idea, or to verbally form in a way that's accessible to somebody else.
Totally.
Complex idea. And I think that's the universal, yeah.
And I'll take it even a step further, is like, and I think too, that to me gets encapsulated in like writing, right? Because if you have a PowerPoint explaining something, you can like hand wave the edges. Whereas if you're writing, it's very clear if you know the thing or not, because you can't really hand wave when it comes to like written communication, right? I also think there's going to be I don't know exactly what it looks like, but if you look at like the web ecosystem right now, there's a bunch of like essentially dev tools that have raised a lot of VC money. Supabase, Remix just raised, like Netlify is now going to be $1 billion company. Like there's all these companies, right? And the way I think about them and the main problems they're going to have besides distribution is going to be education. I think there's going to be an entire wave of technical educators who come across, and I don't know if there's going to be a business that's formed around this or what it looks like, but all of these companies have problem, like it's an education problem, right? Especially if it's a technical company. Like Supabase's biggest problem isn't getting new developers because it's a great product. It's education around Supabase, right? And so I think I don't know exactly what it looks like, but that's what I've been thinking a lot lately, is like there's such a need for technical communicators, and there's not a lot of good ones. And if there are, they're hard to find, right? Both of us would love to hire. If you can explain things technically well, I would love to hire you. You would do the same, right? It's just so hard to find that person. And not even for like boot camp or like educators, but like, again, technical companies it's in such a need too. It's like kind of getting wrapped into DevRel right now, which is a little bit weird to me. But that's the way I see it. It's like a lot of DevRels are really just educators.
Is that Dev Relations or?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, the sort of evangelist type role, whereas that, yeah. And to me, if we were TechCrunch 2014, you'd say the real thing that we're trying to solve in the bigger picture is, humans' greatest value now is our ability to have a mental model of a complexity. That's pretty much like our biggest edge on the machines.
Yeah.
And so, if you were to do this sort of TechCrunch, what are we disrupting? 2014, what's the $10 trillion market? It is the ability for people. This is a rebrand of education, by the way, but it's basically education. But it's the ability for people throughout their lives to absorb complex mental models that then enable them to have autonomy to solve problems or with any given technology or any given system. And that, to me, is a striking kind of example of just how much that is one of the central, material goals of a society. And I mean, that's what education is, but it's interesting to think of it from that lens as one of the very few edges that we will continue to have over the machines. By the way, I didn't want to make that the angle of the.
Yeah, I dig it. Yeah, I dig it. I agree with that. So
we've got some questions here. Should we have a look at them?
Yep, let's do it.
Windu says, is there a rule pattern for what goes on the callback queue versus a microtask queue, or do you just memorize what goes where in the event? So Windu, I think, maybe we can go to the exact details. Is from giving these talks myself, in Node there are even more queues. In the browser, I think I'm right in saying classic browser APIs that use callbacks go in the regular callback queue, and promise-based implementations go in the microtask queue. Is that a memorization thing? I guess a memorization of which queue, what goes in which queue. Yes, I guess it's sort of implementation detail. I think that is something that's covered in the async hard parts window, if you haven't had a chance to see it. But Tyler, is that about right, or is there anything you'd add to that?
I think you're totally right. We have a post on it too. I think I don't know if this is like the spirit of the question. I try, and I know you're the same way. It's fun because I could like speak about my opinion, and I know they almost always line up with your opinion, which is really convenient, especially in these kind of conversations. I try to get away from like memorizing things like that. Like if it's something that's like, oh, it helps me to become a better developer if I understand the difference between like the microtask queue or the callback queue, sure. Then like memorize it and like know those things. But it mostly in this case, it doesn't help you too much. It is kind of a good like bar trivia thing. And it's good if you're really like trying to understand like what's under the hood. But usually details like this, I don't get super caught up in because like I've learned and unlearned and relearned that about 10 times over my career. And it'll keep happening because like I just don't, it's not like vocab I need to use every day. But it is important to understand how callbacks work, how promises work, async await works, like all of those things. So anyway, I don't know if that's...
Is the notion that there is a queue and there are queues. And the notion that there is in an event-based system, there are functions that are just going to be, passed to a queue and queued up. Like that's the kind of.
It's the mental model of that rather than like the implementation.
Can we expect a course on Node or microservices?
We have a Node course outline that we just made. There's a few other things we're doing first. We're working with. I don't think we've announced this yet, but we're working with Tanner Lindsley, creator of React Query, on a React Query course. So we're collaborating with him. We have an XJS course coming out soon. And then from there, we'll reevaluate because everything always changes in 3 months naturally. So we'll probably one day have a Node course, but it's not in the immediate future, at least for us. So
amazing. We have, Ashraf, we have a Node hard parts kind of course thing that under the hood program that we do every, and again, even here, I would say this, Tyler, Tyler's UI dev approach does complement the under the hood programs that we do at Codesmith with these sort of shorter form versions, because they really are like just have a mental model and then all features that's for you. Whereas, and that's why as I say, you're the one person I do watch. I do want to know the incremental building that mental model, including features as well, rather than just like here is a mental model only, and then rest is figure. There is a play, and that's a weakness of my talks is that you ain't going to see code, and actually one does need to see those things are. So that's why I always think our talks kind of go hand in hand.
Totally.
Happening Dev says, do you think it's better to learn JavaScript, React, Express, etc., as fast as you can, even if you just learn 50%, and start applying for interviews, let's say in 1 or 2 months, or go deep and spend 6 months and then start applying? So, obviously there's specific here. And then I guess there's the sort of, that you're asking the sort of question of, we can say the easy thing here, right? That like, to some extent, it's going to be a balance between going deep and making it work for the rest of your career. And I think that's a mentality to almost like, even this distinction here is going to be a matter of degree. And the real thing I can take away from this is only you're going to go hard part style on something and you're going to just make it work off and on for the rest of one's career, right? Like, is that, I don't know.
Yeah, you're the authority here when it comes to like getting jobs, but I think the way I've always looked at it is like become really good at what they're going to pay you to do and become okay at everything else until you have time to do that, right? Like that's the approach I've always taken.
I like one of the things we say is you do need to be expert in something. Now it may be React, it may be honestly, it could be pure JavaScript. Actually, that's a better way of putting it than I did. Yeah, you do need to be expert in something to get a job, because what it does is it shows the person you're talking to you can be expert in something. It also allows you to, honestly, I'm not saying blow the mind of the interviewer per se, but like, you're probably going to be a bit more expert than them in something of it. And that's a nice place to be when you want to show, your credibility to an interviewer. I hope that helps. Happening Dev. Feel free to ask a follow-up though. Okay, Anderson Rosa says, do you have examples of how closure is used in libraries such as React? Yes. What I would say is go look at that use state stuff. These are regular functions that are going to somehow, you're going to use functions that when called are somehow going to still have access to some persistent state, or at least functions that have access to persistent state. And so you're not going to be passing those around explicitly. And so there's some closure stuff going on in some of those methods. Is that roughly right?
Like hooks are essentially that's all it is closures. So, yep.
All right. Get myself down. Okay, Ashraf says, have you tried Snowpack, ESBuild? Tyler, your work on Webpack helped me a lot in making sense of that. Yeah, do you want to, Tyler, take this?
Yeah, I haven't dove too far into them, but the way I look at it is like, I follow a lot of really smart people, and then I just get excited what they're excited about. I have a lot of really smart friends who are excited specifically about pretty much all three of those, because they are kind of the next evolution of Webpack. It's funny because they're all like taking different trade-offs. The good part is all of them are way faster than Webpack ever was, and the ergonomics around them are probably way better too. I say that, haven't really used them. I've never used either of those three like that much, but I have used Webpack, and Webpack is terrible for that kind of thing. So I could just assume it's better. So yeah, I haven't played around with them. That's something like build tool kind of stuff. Like I don't really love that kind of stuff. Which is why like Webpack, it kind of forced my hand to get really familiar with it because I had to teach it. Where the other three, like, we'll see what those look like when I have time to like dive into them. But I have heard really good things from some really smart people. So
that's awesome. And just something that jolted my mind on is this idea of something that if I were to say back to Happening Dev about JS, React, Express, you should like go deep. One of the biggest things I think that we try and teach in the hiring program is that all these technologies, they're not like the way, the truth, and the whatever. They are, just as Tyler said, they're like, there was a not quite so great solution for person trying to make computer do thing, and so let's try and build a slightly better one. And the biggest problem is, the biggest challenge you're trying to solve usually is making the developer's life easier, making our lives easier. And so in each of those, you say that word ergonomics is such a crucial piece. Now, yes, performance matters, but one's attracted to some of these frameworks or tools or libraries, often for large reason because of how they make our lives as engineers easier. Now, that sounds obvious to say, but it is a mindset shift to try and get to, where as you talk, it just prompted me to think about this, as you think Happening Dev or others about your job search or about pursuing, just not being scared to say and not being scared to feel this tool or this library or this framework doesn't work for me and is not sort of ergonomic. It isn't a great developer experience for me. And to know that everything that you're using was made up by somebody else to try and make their life writing code to control a machine easier. And it's such a mindset to shift to, because it should give you the confidence to not feel as much like these things are the truths that you're discovering, that React is the truth. No, this is a set of compromises with trade-offs that is more or less beneficial for you versus another alternative tool. And I know it sounds a bit of a sort of separate point, but something that's been on my mind a bit. And I think if there's one thing that as one grows as an engineer, it's kind of coming to terms with that these new exciting tools here are really interesting, but they're also part of that broad set of tools you have. And, used by people with all the trade-offs that come with them and all the kind of, balances of judgment that are needed to decide whether to use them or not. Anyway, there you go. It's a slight addition. But Kurt says, as someone trying to do a career shift coming from a non-technical field, I'm trying to understand the future career possibilities of a graduating program like Codesmith. Does going through a program as Codesmith determine what discipline or specialty within the software engineering industry you go into? So Kurt, I mean, this sounds like sort of a Codesmith one, but I think Tyler will just add even more on this. But the easy answer is to say no, and the whole point of Codesmith is not to be. If Codesmith taught a programming language, JavaScript, it does, but like if that's what it was teaching, it wouldn't work. It's teaching what really makes a great engineer, which is, I think fundamentally, by the way, the ability to take on new problems with new technologies that you have not yet seen before. And you just get better and better at that. And that ability to grow is agnostic to programming language, to the point that like the vast majority of what makes picking up a new code base as you join a company hard is not whether or not you know JavaScript. It's not whether or not you know Python. It's not whether or not you know Go. It's the code base is implemented in just a vastly complex way with a vast amount of interdependencies that are specific and unique to that code base. And so with that in mind, it's really like independent of your language. Like specifically, that means like grads, I don't know what percentage it is, but probably only 40% are in React Node. Maybe not even that. But that's a specific examples, but it's a deeper thing. It's like programming isn't about a programming language. It's about general concepts and general talents that are independent of any given language.
Yeah, I think by the fact how many times we've said mental models in this conversation kind of proves your point, right? And that's why I love Codesmith too, and we always like geek out about education because we have the same philosophy around that. So I've had friends go through Codesmith, and it's what he said is true. As someone who doesn't get paid when people go to Codesmith, it's true. So,
but also that continues beyond, right? And in the end, that's why we talk about community with ui.dev, or we talk about these things are bigger than individual frameworks. That being said, the process of, that's why we come back to that very first point that you made, like the process of going deep on something is what matters, not almost a topic that one goes deep on. Excellently Knowledgeable says, you teach the way to break down code, execution context, sort of execution call stack, but when it comes to transform problems into code, what do we do? Yeah, I mean, Excellently Knowledgeable, pushing some buttons there, which is, hey, the talks give you a nice coherent story, but bloody hell, I've got to go and do it and then figure it out. What do you think? What do you think, Tyler?
I think with those kind of, so it's important to understand like the context of what you're learning. Like for execution context, call stack, the queue questions earlier, right? Like all of those are almost like not necessarily philosophical because it's how JavaScript works under the hood, but like you don't think about those things as you're programming, right? Whereas if you're learning like the use effect hook in React, you do, right? So there's a difference between learning like almost like the mechanism and then like the API. And they're two very different things, right? So I don't like when I'm learning about like the under the hoodie kind of stuff, I don't really worry too much about like, okay, how do I directly apply this? Because like, I mean, the call stack, that's the whole thing. Like that's essentially the whole language, like that's JavaScript, right? So it's like, how do I apply that? Well, like I invoke a function, like that's how you, which is again, the whole thing, right? So it's like, I don't really worry about like the implementation of those kind of things. Because usually like the QE stuff, the callback stuff, all that stuff, like every time I write JavaScript is like implementing those kind of things, right?
It's the grammar, it's the foundations, but then you do just have to go and actually,
Totally.
do. And unfortunately, of course, as we both, we came back to the point from earlier, sometimes just make it work. Okay, final question here, I think, as we're coming to our close. Inshira says, thank you both. So useful. That's really lovely of you, Inshira. As educators, were there concepts that you have been particularly tricky to communicate? And how did you subsequently adapt and challenge your own teaching methods? Bloody hell. I have some thoughts on this, but Tyler,
I do too.
This
Yeah,
is like essentially what we think about, right?
Yeah, Redux is a pain in the butt to teach. That's been to this day still, and I've taught some very difficult things. That's been the hardest thing to teach because Redux has fundamentally like a chicken and an egg problem, right? Where you have like your actions and then you have like your dispatchers, and like which one do you talk about first? Because they're both important. And so like how do you break that down from like a teaching? Because our whole thing is like, okay, I take a thing, I break it up into pieces, and I create like a linear path that feels very natural to go through that specific topic. With Redux, it's almost impossible by definition to do that because like you have these two fundamental things that if you need to dispatch something, you need an action, and to understand actions, and so that was the hardest one for me. We did a Redux course, we launched it, I hated it, I essentially threw it away, created another one. That one ended up being like a much better one. But yeah, it was tricky to do that, and it was good because like it allowed me to like, after throwing away the first one, like really step back and be like, okay, like how do I, like, what are my core teaching philosophies and how do I take those to like to teach this really like fairly complicated thing, and it worked out doing that. So
the only thing I'd add is just even saying that about Redux alone goes a long way to somebody. I always come back to, the professor at college who would do it should be obvious. And I didn't have too many of those, but like there were some professors who do it should be obvious at this point. Mm-hmm. And it's just like, even acknowledging just how complex something is, mm-hmm. Goes a long way, I think, to helping people have the patience to see the two pieces come together. Mm-hmm. For me, really anything that the core hard parts has at times made me overly committed to wanting to show the execution of the pure JavaScript piece. And yet, if I had started from, I don't know, the machine code in which JavaScript is written as my kind of hard parts, then would I be tempted to go 2 layers too deep on teaching the event loop or whatever? And the answer is probably yes. But once you've got that foundational like JavaScript model, you can be at risk, as I often have been, with things like teaching Node or teaching React, to want to build from that pure JavaScript on every single thing. And yet actually sometimes you just got to accept that function or that feature is a black box or behaves in this way as an individual component, not component that reacts, but your unit of behavior, action, not as something that you need to understand the innards of. And sometimes my temptation to break out each piece, I have to force myself up a level to not, you just sometimes don't need. It's just, this does that. And that, because in the end, the equals, the assignment operator is this does that. Now, how's it doing it in terms of memory? We could explain, and I will figure out. I don't going to explain right now, but one could figure out. But one doesn't because it's not relevant. And so the biggest thing I struggle with, or have to constantly remind myself, is go one level up or do it or whatever. Like, know the right level of abstraction for a given topic. And especially when you built a fully mental model of your own for one topic that others derive from, you can be really tempted to always start at that level. And that's a weakness, I think, for me.
That's good, because that leads nicely into the next question, which is a very technical question.
How global objects is created in the first place without the object constructor function, the turn size and depth. You know what? I actually think I've got Larabe here. Tyler, do you have an answer to this?
I don't have. That's like a JavaScript spec question. I don't think I even have a good answer.
So Larabe, I hope we're pronouncing that right. Look out for a video as we talk about that at some point. I think that could be fun to cover. Our last person here, if you were hypothetically working at a software company and to conduct technical interviews, what would be questions that you would ask to determine the general proficiency of the candidate? I honestly think we'd ask a lot like we do for the Codesmith program, which is have them hit blocks. Have them hit blocks multiple times, whatever that block is, in writing some code and solving some problem, and see how somebody verbalizes through it, can take one step by step, debug through. Honestly, the hardest interview questions I got that honestly probably actually captured where I was really at technically were debugging actual code bases. I don't know. That's just one instinct for me. Like, they were the ones that really caught me out. There was no hiding on those.
Yeah, it would. It's such a hard thing, and which is why there's billion-dollar companies who haven't figured out their hiring process, and they just resort to like the leak code problems everyone does. I think if I were doing it, we're kind of running out of time, so I'll be short. But basically, it'll be around making sure uh, developers have a good mental model for the problem they're solving and they can communicate effectively technically. And like the implementation of the code should be like somewhat right if we ask like whatever leak code problems. But to me, it's more of like way of thinking, way of approaching a problem and way of communicating. Because if you can do those things, then we can hire you as a manager later on. Like you could do different roles in the company if that needed to be. So
Yeah. Question here about PPP discounts. Tyler, it sounds
I can answer that one. So the question is, any thoughts on making the education accessible across the globe? Tyler, we support PPP pricing. Codesmith doesn't. The reason for that has to do with like marginal cost, right? To bring on 1,000 more students costs us essentially zero. To bring on 1,000 more students costs Codesmith a lot more than zero, right? So it's easy for us to have PPP pricing because we have zero marginal cost essentially for reproduction. For Codesmith, they don't have that, and they have like fixed cost per student. So you could talk more on that, but that's like the framing. Like if we had an in-person thing, you probably wouldn't get PPP pricing, which is like purchase parity pricing based on where you live, just because it's near.
awesome, which is awesome.
It's just hard to do.
It's a brilliant model. I mean, look, I think if we were to actually be able to sort of quote operate out of places that maybe had a lower cost of living as part of our long term, I think it would make sense. Absolutely. In the meantime, I think the best thing we can do is just continue to have as much free content, as many free workshops as possible, and that's always been the model. Like not promoting the core program, only ever promoting the free content from which then people may or may not aspire to the main program. Jeff says, do you find teaching context in production with Redux is helpful?
This is a fun one, Jeff. To be honest, when I first started teaching Redux, I don't know how long you've been in the React space. Context used to not be a recommended thing from the React team. Like there was a way to do it, but the context API wasn't what it is today. It was super gross. And they literally had on the documentation, like, don't use context because like it will change. And it was like that for like 3 years, from like 2013 to like 16 or 17, until the new context API came out. So the answer was unfortunately no, because context wasn't what it is today, where now you could rely on context because like if you're using React, you probably know what context is already. But back in the day, like that wasn't really a thing. And only a few like Redux used it under the hood. React Router used it because they needed to, but like it wasn't a thing that like you would just normally use back in the day. So ironically, no, I couldn't rely on that. So
amazing. Lindsay says, Lindsay, I hope I get that pronunciation right. When are you dropping WebAssembly, the hard parts? Lindsay, if were I to even understand any of those things. But that's a joy, and it brings it back to what Tyler said at the very start. And I think we all feel, which is in the end, the greatest joy comes from going deep on developing one's understanding of these concepts. And I do sometimes think as instructors or content developers that we do get the most fulfillment because we get to actually go deep on this stuff in order to create our content. Okay. Oh, well, thank you, everybody. That was absolutely lovely to have all of you. It was so kind of you all to, join us on and listen to us chit chat, and for Tyler and myself to get a longer period of time to chat than we usually do. And so, shall I leave it for a final goodbye and thank you, Tyler?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Thanks to Ashley for hosting, and look forward to seeing you on hopefully another one of these maybe very soon.
Let's do it. I'm down. We'll do them quarterly. We'll chats with Will. I'm all for it. You tell me when. Like I said, I'll be here. I love chatting. We have the same philosophies as we've seen, kind of annoyingly. So I'm sure people are like, oh, this is like we essentially have the same like JavaScript brain, which is fine. But yeah, I'm always happy. This was a blast. Yeah.
Thanks so much, everybody. It was lovely for me as well. And I really, really appreciate everybody. see you all soon. Cheers, people.
See ya.